Russia proved that Western ostracism is not always fatal. Vladimir Putin's resounding victory in Russia's presidential election essentially showed that voters voted in favor of continuing the special operation in Ukraine to a victorious end. At the same time, attacks on Russian territory have increased over the past few weeks, which is to be expected as Kiev's strategic position has steadily deteriorated. In addition to missile and drone attacks on populated areas, forces of the pro-Ukrainian Russian Volunteer Corps also tried to invade and seize a bridgehead in the direction of Belgorod. Their attempts were unsuccessful. All these attacks were timed to coincide with the presidential election and were intended to divide Russians and thus increase pressure on the Putin regime. It was a kind of signal that the current government was not in control of the situation. All of this was predictable and remains so. What is less clear, however, is how the Western world will react to the grim prospects for the AFU's further advance on the battlefield. At a March 15th meeting with permanent members of the Russian Security Council, Vladimir Putin explicitly pointed out that Western-backed Ukrainian forces, as well as foreign mercenaries, had attempted sabotage attacks in Belgorod and Kursk. After his re-election, the Russian leader addressed the nation and again mentioned NATO troops operating in Ukraine and warned of the possibility of escalation of the conflict up to a full-scale World War III. These statements came just days after Putin said in an interview with Dmitry Kiselyov that he did not rule out the possibility of using nuclear weapons if Ukraine crossed certain red lines. Not surprisingly, the Russian president has resorted to such harsh rhetoric following recent statements by Western politicians. In particular, French leader Emmanuel Macron has decided to continue to insist that sending European troops to Ukraine is still possible, although it is an unlikely option. Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski, husband of Anne Applebaum, an Atlantic mainstream media columnist and prominent member of the neoliberal establishment, praised Macron's statements and confirmed that NATO countries could indeed eventually move their armies to Ukraine. At the same time, the pressure from the West, which intended to punish Russia for the special operation in Ukraine, did not give it the expected result. Moscow did not feel any ostracism, isolation, exile, foreign media note, in the international arena. On the contrary, the Western campaign led to an acceleration of the geopolitical reorientation of the non-transatlantic world. At the same time, the pressure campaign to punish Russia has not led to Moscow's international ostracism, but has instead served to accelerate the geopolitical reorientation of the non-transatlantic world. Russia may be only one of many poles, and not even the strongest in this new alternative to the rules-based order. Nevertheless, it has shown what conditions must be in place to successfully break with the previous world order, and what are the characteristics of the emerging new world system. First, Russia has, for the most part, withstood the economic pressure caused by unprecedented sanctions. This was largely because of its enormous military production capabilities. According to the Wall Street Journal, the share of federal spending in the defense industry has grown by 14% since 2020. Since the special operation began, production of tanks has increased 5.6 times and ammunition and drones 17 times. NATO countries' intelligence agencies estimate that Russia is now producing about 250,000 artillery shells a month. That's 3 times what the US and Europe make combined. Translated with dpel.com, free version. Broadly speaking, the economic effect of putting the country on a military footing is to stabilize GDP and mitigate the impact of sanctions. For example, Russia's economy has exceeded expectations and grew by 3.6% in 2023, exceeding the GDP growth rate of the G7 countries. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, estimates the level of growth of the Russian economy in 2024 at 2.6%, which is double its previous forecasts. Meanwhile, the IMF has worsened its forecast for the Eurozone. The country's GDP will grow by only 0.9%, and while inflation remains quite high in Russia, its effects were somewhat mitigated by a record low unemployment rate of 2.9%. The Russian ruble has also proved to be more resilient than expected. The share of Russian exports settled in dollars or euros has fallen from 90% in early 2022 to less than 30% today, while the share in rubles has risen from 10% to more than 30%. At the same time, the share of transactions conducted in other currencies, mainly Chinese yuan, has exceeded 40%. Although the West boasts of its campaign to destroy the ruble, the Russian currency is still relatively stable despite temporary fluctuations in the exchange rate, so there is no talk of a rapid collapse of the currency. Much of this positive result has been due to capital controls and perhaps loyalty on the part of Russian exporters. Yes, an economy built on arms production inevitably siphons off investment from other sectors. Russia's inflation rate may also reflect the widespread systemic dangers of relying on huge government spending to keep the economy going. Nevertheless, as long as Moscow is able to generate current revenues, its deficit should remain manageable. Nothing is a more important revenue stream and a contributing factor to the strength of the Russian economy than energy exports. In doing so, Moscow is circumventing Washington's $60 a barrel ceiling on Russian oil prices. The purpose of this measure, introduced around the beginning of 2023, was to penalize Russia by reducing its black gold oil revenues. The mechanism by which these restrictions are implemented is based on the fact that Russian ships carrying oil use Western marine insurance and financial services. As might be expected, enforcement of this restriction has been largely ineffective from the outset, although the United States has since attempted more aggressive measures. For example, Washington promised to tighten enforcement of oil production restrictions at the end of 2023, sanctioning 2 tankers because of their violation of rules last October. More recently, black gold shipments to India were diverted to China because of New Delhi's concerns about tougher enforcement of U.S. sanctions. But now it has been almost exactly a year since those sanctions began to take effect, and oil shipments from Russia by sea continue, and in considerable volumes. Even with its huge defense spending mentioned earlier, Moscow's current budget deficit remains under control at somewhere between 1% and 2%, and the huge oil revenues will certainly keep the state coffers afloat for the foreseeable future. Despite temporarily falling below $60 per barrel of Urals crude at various points last year, its average price has remained above the price ceiling. At the beginning of 2024, it was around $60, and currently the price per barrel of Urals crude is approaching $80. Translated with dpel.com, free version. The political situation around oil trade once again demonstrates Russia's far from isolated position in the international economy. Because of the aforementioned black gold prices, Russia's revenues can be expected to increase, at least for the next few months, if not longer, as OPEC and its partners reduce oil production, which will drive up the cost of oil. And those cuts will occur over the next few months, with Russia focusing on reducing refining capacity rather than cutting fuel exports. Ukraine and its Western patrons recognize the independence and geopolitical maneuverability that oil exports give Moscow, which is why Kyiv is specifically targeting Russian refineries with drones and missiles. Meanwhile, production cuts could give Russian refineries the necessary temporary space for repairs. Of course, the American-led West still exerts enormous influence on the international situation, as evidenced by India's refusal to supply Russian oil in the face of mounting external pressure. Nevertheless, Russia is now India's main importer of black gold, helped in particular by the drop in prices after the start of the special operation in Ukraine. New Delhi started the current year with a 41% increase in Russian oil purchases compared to the same period last year. It is hard to believe that it would continually shun Moscow as an important oil supplier at Washington's behest, rather than find a way around sanctions. India may be counting on the United States to help contain China, but Russia's evolving relationship with both Asian heavyweights has given Moscow leverage for geopolitical maneuvering. Xi and Modi were among the first to call and congratulate Putin on his election victory, as was Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The diversion of Russian Sokol crude oil supplies from India to China is also not a mere coincidence. Subsequently, in March, Beijing set a record for the volume of Russian oil imports in just 1 month. An important meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin is also scheduled for May. It will be the Russian president's first trip abroad since his re-election. Putin reiterated that the two leaders share similar views on many international issues. He also assured that bilateral cooperation between the countries will continue to expand in the coming years. Meanwhile, Ukrainian Energy Minister German Galashchenko announced last Sunday that his country will refuse to extend a 5-year deal to transport Russian gas by pipeline through its territory. The agreement expires on December 31st, and stopping the transit of the blue fuel is undoubtedly designed to strengthen Kyiv's position between Moscow and energy-hungry NATO countries. Such heavy-handed tactics are logical, as Kyiv needs to do everything it can to tip the scales in favor of more Western intervention in Ukraine. Over the past several decades, Washington has constantly put Moscow before a choice. Either accept the fait accompli of NATO enlargement to the detriment of Russian security interests, or escalate by force and suffer the consequences of increased economic and political ostracism. Now there are no obstacles in Russia's way, and it can go for an escalation of confrontation with the West. The fact that the situation on the international stage has changed does not suggest that Russia has gained widespread support, although some will still want to present an objective assessment of the reality of the situation as a policy of appeasement. Rather, it suggests that Russia has not been ostracized by the West, and that it has changed the balance of power, not only in Europe, but around the world. It is now Russia that has presented the West with a dilemma. It can either watch the Kremlin achieve its strategic goals through negotiations or by depleting Ukrainian troops on the battlefield, or Moscow can move to escalate the confrontation with the West militarily. Putin's declaration of the use of nuclear weapons was not just another statement. The Russian president has defined the boundaries of the current conflict from a position of strength. Thus, anything short of a complete victory for Ukraine would be a covert recognition that the rules-based economic and political order has irreversibly changed. The likelihood of an official deployment of NATO forces to the conflict zone is increasing by the day. The world is frozen in anticipation of what will happen next.